apologies for the delay. There was a airport service breakfast meeting that is still going on and will be filtering in a little bit more. I'd like to call the Joint City Council Planning Commission meeting to order, and can we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Francisco.
Here.
Hodges. House. Maria.
Here.
Rouse. White. Mayor Schneider.
Here.
Planning Commissioner Bartlett.
Here.
Campanella.
Here.
Stewart.
Here.
Larson.
Here.
Ward.
Here.
Thompson.
Here.
Here.
Okay. And is there any public comment for items that are not on today's agenda? Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public comment and then just moving on over to Ms. Weiss. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Schneider, and good morning, council members and Planning Commission. Thank you very much for having this meeting with us again, the Planning Division semi-annual workload meeting. We did meet in February of this year, and that was an exciting meeting because we were unveiling the priority implementation items for the general plan recently adopted just in December last year. And so today's meeting actually is, from an overview standpoint on implementation of the general plan, pretty basic in terms of status reports. All the priority projects are underway at one step or another, and we'll be sharing that information with you. Today we will also be talking briefly about other programs in the Planning Division. So I realize that for those of you that are with your back to the screen, it might be hard to follow along with PowerPoint, but it's a brief presentation in terms of other programs, and then mirrors some of the written material we've provided in the staff report as well for general plan. So I'll briefly be discussing zoning information and enforcement section, design review and historic preservation, development and environmental review, and touch on some major projects. And then John Ledbetter will give you the status report on the general plan. So next. In terms of zoning and enforcement, a few highlights to comment on. We have had quite difficult time in terms of resources in the zoning enforcement due to a number of circumstances. But recently, there is good news in zoning enforcement in that we have just been authorized for an hourly staff to come on, and they'll be here in a few weeks working through the end of the fiscal year. So this was actually not a budgeted hourly staff, but because we've had some absences and shortage in this area, we were authorized to use salary savings and such to bring on hourly enforcement. And our practice with this has been quite effective, actually, bringing people on and focus on high priority issues. We've also had assistance recently with 10 hours from a staff person in environmental services, Sue Sadler, who's also a city enforcement officer, and so she's familiar with some of the admin citation program and such. So she's been working with us for about 10 hours a week recently. And then we've had some assistance from the Building and Safety Division. It started as a cross-training effort with the BIA, Building Inspector Aid staff interested in planning work, and as an opportunity to better understand what goes on across the counters here. We've been just recently working with one of the BIAs, and they'll be doing a little bit of enforcement work. The staff, and I think perhaps council members as well, have had some frustrations as a result of our lack of enforcement activity. We have an enforcement program where we tier the complaints or inquiries into high priority, and some of those are land use and some of those are sign-related priorities. And then as we go down the list, we do get complaints and inquiries on lower priority items that we're not able to get to because as of late, we've had barely no staff to even get to the high priorities. But that will be changing for this next part, the rest of the fiscal year, where we will have some resources to devote. So I wanted to let you know about that. Also, under Plan Check and working with Building and Safety and the AIA and Contractors Association, actually just last night, George Estrella, Lonnie Cassidy from Building and Safety, Renee Brook from Zoning Section, and I attended the AIA quarterly meeting, where we had been in a quarterly meeting with the AIA and contractors last November, And since that time, city staff has been working very closely with a work group of the AIA, as well as internally, to address concerns about the timeliness of plan check. Plan check was one of the primary concerns, and also the nature of the corrections and difficulty in resolving corrections were concerns expressed by AIA and Contractor Association members. And we have really stepped up and revised our communication methods. Building and safety in particular is much more available now for meetings to go over and resolve questions with applicants. And in zoning, again, we were able to devote some additional resources through some overtime and catch up on our backlog. And so we're doing a better job being timely in our plan check process. Another issue in the zoning enforcement section. Yeah.
Are these shortages of staff because of budget cutbacks and elimination of positions, or because you haven't been able to keep existing positions filled?
The difficulties in meeting plan check timelines is related to a couple of things. One is we have always had one full-time dedicated plan checker in zoning, but as the planning division staff has been cut over the years, we've had less staff to call upon working at the counter, supporting the design review boards, and zoning enforcement and so forth, so that it has had a shortening of additional support to plan check. But what we decided to do is pull in those additional supports that we typically would have had with the use of some overtime. The other reason for not being able to keep up with the timelines is actually certain permit activity in the realm of building permits has been quite high. Unlike projects coming to the Planning Commission where we've seen a real drop, in the building permit activity is fairly high in terms of the volume of projects. A lot of people making smaller tenant improvements and home improvement projects. So it was a combination of workload and staff.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The area that I have heard concerns about is the public works side of plan check. Is that part of your presentation today, or is that obviously that's not necessarily your purview, but are you reporting on that as well?
Well, I can report on in response to Councilmember White. The land development team supervisors, which are supervisors from public works, engineering, transportation, and then in building and safety, that's inspection and plan check, Renee Brook in planning, and Danny Cato from planning, as well as Supervisor, I think, Austin from the fire department. They are meeting regularly and working on issues, and we all work groups were really aware of some areas of concern. And so with respect to public works, in particular, building and safety has helped them a lot lately. Again, sorting through projects that perhaps building and safety could actually sign off on and not necessarily need to route to public works. And good news, public works was just able to hire a new project engineer just coming on board the last week or so. His name is Tom Scott, and he came from the city of Fillmore. He's a licensed civil engineer, and so I think things are turning around in public works as well. Yeah. So the last area of comment for the zoning program I wanted to touch on is staff working with the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors. I believe the council is all aware that the association turned in a letter to staff and the council raising concerns about the ZIR process. City staff has been meeting and working with the association for a number of years now, and we have, again, made adjustments in some of the areas of concern that I think they are happy with. However, there continues to be some areas of concern with issues having not been identified in earlier zoning information reports, and then now doing a more thorough job seeing these problems. And in the realm of their work, that industry and just real estate in general has become much more difficult through the foreclosures, bank short sales, It's just the industry they're in right now, and our part in it is causing them some concern. So we have had internal meetings, including meetings with Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Wiley, and we will be speaking with the a subcommittee of the association very soon for follow-up on some of their concerns. So, next slide. Thanks. In terms of design review and historic preservation, of course, we're all very happy that we had the adoption of the historic resources element. And as that relates to the ongoing work program, I think we were able to explain that one of the great things about the historic resources element is now in one document, we talk about all the different programs and approaches and different ideas that we can have to use in the community for historic resource preservation. And we already are underway with a number of those programs. So in terms of designations, we had a hearing yesterday with the council. We have another one coming up in November. We've recently just brought on an intern who's going to help us with a designation or two. So trying to stay on track. I think the HLC has a goal of, so many designations per year, just trying to set a goal to work towards working through designations. Surveys, there are a number of surveys that are in different stages of completion. Some of you may be aware, certainly, of the Lower Riviera survey, which is the most recent comprehensive survey, but we've also been working in the West Downtown area on a survey. An earlier survey was done in the waterfront area. One of the reasons those surveys really haven't come forward is because a companion piece in the historic preservation program would be the districting. What you find as a result of a survey is that certain areas may qualify as a historic district. So the staff in this program has been working on multiple levels. They keep all of these projects moving at some pace that they're able to, and I'm quite impressed by how Mr. Limon has managed to keep all these balls in the air. And now with Nicole Hernandez here, our new urban historian, I expect we'll be moving forward even faster on a lot of these programs. The comment on the database and web interface, you may have noted in the written staff report that I made a comment regarding budget. We, for some time, have had an interest in really developing a high-quality, on par with other communities, database and web access in terms of historic resources. And to a large degree, not having the budget has been what's been holding us back. However, again, when the opportunity presented itself, we were able to bring on some consultant help to get the database in shape. We've also worked with the IT staff, IS staff at the city, and they have done a survey of cost and possible web interface. There is a price tag related to that, and Mr. Limon has actually had conversations with the Pearl Chase Society, and I'm not sure if they're going to be here today. He said they might be. They have an interest in some sort of matching grant with the city, and they would be interested in donating some funds to help move the web interface and database programs along. So that may be something you hear about, again, if they're not here today. We'll have a follow-up on that item.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Ms. Weiss, a question along those lines. For other communities that have already implemented this database, if they were, have we spoken with them about where their sources of funding? Are there state and federal grants that might be accessible in addition to the sources we're looking at now?
Madam Mayor and Commissioner Schwartz, I'm not really able to answer that question. I don't see Jaime in the... Oh, there he is. Please, do you want to come on up to the microphone? Thanks.
Hello, good morning. We did, in fact, do some research specifically the city of San Diego allowed us to get on their actual database and access it so we can understand how they use it. We did talk to them about funding. Typically, the city does allocate the funds. It's hard to get a grant like that. I know the state does have some funds, but they are also hurting. So it's relatively a minor cost in comparison. I think they've given us a $15,000 estimate, but we've been in the cutting mode the last several years, and so the desire to have that is still there. And hopefully, again, with the Pearl Chase Society teaming up with them, we can get to that purpose. And if you don't understand what that means, it really means the ability for the general public to go to our website, punch in an address search engine, and be able to see all the wonderful history we have with these sites and these properties and these survey forms. And it's a really common thing for communities to have, so we're sort of behind on that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Is it the kind of thing that ultimately would result in cost savings, or is it simply a convenience for the public?
We do get a lot of office drop-in requests for information. I'm not sure that it would eliminate that entirely, so it's hard to say how much savings there would be. However, I think if we're really involved in a survey and we have active discussions going on, again, it will help the public be informed, and we would reach more people. I think some people are just more inclined to come into the office anyway, and so we're going to continue to speak directly with a certain number of people anyway, in either effect. Okay, in terms of last few bullets here, the historic resources element implementation, the items that I've just covered in the list above certainly are historic resource implementation items, but further prioritization and specifically looking at different guidelines and such, that will follow. I think for years now we've actually been thinking about having just a specific work session with you all and the Historic Landmarks Commission on the overall work program. And so that would be something down the line that we schedule and further prioritize the implementation of the Historic Resources work program. Next slide. In development and environmental review, a few comments. Again, over the years we have had adjustments in the staffing level for a variety of reasons in the environmental review area, and some more are on the way, so I thought I would just touch on this. We had an environmental review supervisor part-time, and that was Deborah Andeloro, and when she retired about 2 years ago, that was again in this budgetary time of tightening up, and so that position was eliminated. We had for a number of years, I think 5 or so, an added position in the Plan Santa Barbara General Plan update process, but as that process was closing, the commitment was always there that we would eliminate that one added position. So in doing that, the environmental analyst in the long-range section, Barbara Shelton, is now being reassigned, and this is only just going on right now. She's just completed the climate action plan, and she's involved in a number of still long-range related projects, but we're transitioning her into the environmental review portion of this section. Also, Melissa Hetrick, who was with us for 3 or 4 years and helped out with capital projects as well as private projects, and I think the Planning Commission saw Melissa regularly at your hearings. She's relocated with her husband to Santa Cruz, and there's a future retirement coming soon with Michael Berman, who's been with us now 10 years. So we would expect that when he leaves, we'll be recruiting for a new environmental analyst. And so in the big scheme of things, the staffing level will have moved over the course of all these changes from 4 people in this area, but that did include 1 related to the general plan, and then 1 half-time supervisor, now back to 2 environmental analysts. Thank you. Major projects. Now, you may have heard about some of these things. There's discussion going on for some of the projects, and then some relate to construction as well. On the Mission Creek project, quite a bit of construction, different phases of that moving forward, and I know you all have had, both Commission and Council have had full updates on that. 101 State Street is the latest addition to the Harborview Inn with the Roma Santas, and then Entrada. And so all three of those projects are adjacent to one another down in the waterfront. And in working with Public Works, they're going to be releasing soon some press release and information to the community, because as all three of those projects get underway with construction in the waterfront area, that's going to be a change in things down there. The Waterfront Hotel, I just made a brief note in the staff report that there are some initial discussions going on with staff and the Parker Family Trust, and they have a new concept. Their commitment is not new. However, they want to see that specific plan and that high-quality hotel project completed in the waterfront. But there will be some additional discussions on a new concept coming forward. There is quite a bit of activity in the Funk Zone, some more creative, which, makes sense in terms of active artist groups and general neighborhood efforts. They are looking at special events and such, as well as property improvement and a few projects coming through to upgrade and create new spaces in the waterfront Funk Zone area. Big projects that we've been working on for a while. One is the Hillside House, and we're still in the environmental impact report phase on that project, and we do expect it to be continuing to move through, but it is moving fairly slowly. The Natural History Museum is still technically in the pre-application stage in terms of city review, but very active in the general community as well as with the adjoining neighbors. My understanding is that the board of the museum is about ready to make some major commitments in terms of moving the project forward, and so we expect to see the application soon. I think in a week or so, the Santa Barbara Bowl has a project, a new entry complex. Portion of that project is actually within the city jurisdiction, and then the majority of the bowl is actually county land, but the Planning Commission will be seeing a project there soon. Okay, just one or two comments. I have invited the chair of the Historical Landmarks Commission, Phil Suding, is here, and we have Paul Zink, vice chair from the ABR. I just wanted to acknowledge that they're here, and if you have any comments or questions and want to be part of the conversation, please come up as well and participate. And now I'll turn it over to John Ledbetter. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reese. Madam Mayor, members of the Planning Commission, City Council, my name is John Ledbetter, and I manage the long-range planning section as well as the general plan implementation efforts. As Betty mentioned early on, we're basically giving you a status briefing of those projects that we had outlined for you at our last joint meeting. And there's been a lot of activity on a variety of different levels, so I'm happy to report out on these for you, starting with the housing element certification, which was certified by HCD in May of this year. Our next steps on the housing element implementation are three of our projects that are on our priority list, and I'll be reporting out on those in just a moment. The housing incentive ordinance for the average unit density, the emergency shelter zoning, which is required by state law, and then the next, as soon as we finish, we're already thinking about the next housing element update, and that's consistent with the SB 375 timeline.
If I could interrupt you, but it's to compliment you, Mr. Ledbetter. I don't know if you realize the lack of news about the RENA numbers, the regional housing needs assessment that the state requires each jurisdiction to do, and it went through SB CAG about a month or so ago with practically no drama it was because of the work, I think, of John Ledbetter and the staff throughout the county and the general plan update being adopted last year, and using that updated general plan to allow us not to have an overblown number of housing requirements from the state as the allocation happened through the county. So as you may recall, last time this happened, we were not happy with the results by a long shot, and we were on a very losing end of a vote. That was a unanimous vote. There was practically no public comment. It just went by so smoothly. So I really want to commend you for that. Sometimes no news is the best news. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I appreciate that. And it really was a good joint effort with all my colleagues on the TPAC to come up with that solution. So we were very happy with that, and it seems to continue now with the 375, and I'll report on that as well. As Ms. Weiss mentioned, the historic resources element was adopted by Council on October 2nd, and as she mentioned to you, the next steps, of course, are implementation priorities with historic districting, the guidelines, demolition by neglect ordinance. There's a lot of different programs that Mr. Lamone has brewing. The average unit density program, also referred to as the housing incentives program, is well underway at this point, initiated by the council in April. We've put together now a draft set of sort of the key components which make up this program, and as you'll recall, this program includes our priority housings of rental housing, co-ops, and employer housing. But it also includes some other incentives to help make these programs happen, and including parking, the one space per residential unit. We're also now looking at commercial parking in terms of each of these individual projects, trying to encourage neighborhood serving type of uses. And variable setbacks are part of the equation, and open space as well, looking at some variations on how we calculate the open space. So we took all that to the Planning Commission, the ABR, and the HLC for initial review. We got some good comments back, particularly on the open space issues, and so we're working on that. We had a employer housing forum this last September, which we felt was quite a success. We had a good turnout of the business community as well as the developers, the architects, bankers sat in on our forum. And what really became clear to us was that this program is going to be very different from the rest of them. The rest of these incentives pretty much are, we go to the zoning ordinance, we change the ordinance, and we're done, basically. But with the employer housing, it's really going to be a process, and we're going to need to work closely with our housing folks and with the community to develop these partnerships. And I can get into a little bit more of that towards the end of the discussion here, and I'm happy to talk about it. Next steps for us will be the PC hearing, Planning Commission to make some formal recommendations and to the council, and we're expecting to come back to the Planning Commission in early next year. The Growth Management Program, again, is underway, initiated at the Planning Commission in May, and we really, the way we see this is there's two main components. There's the allocation categories that you're all familiar with from Measure E, vacant, small addition, minor addition, community priority, economic development, et cetera, and some new ones. That portion we have a good handle on, mainly because most of it's been nailed down pretty clearly in through the general plan process and the update. With, of course, the overall number being reduced from 3.0 in Measure E to 1.35. And the other component, though, is the traffic strategy. And now we're kind of in a new land, if you will, for the traffic, given the EIR findings of cumulative impact, and those were overridden. And so that's taken us a little bit longer. It's a little bit more of a challenging issue in terms of developing the appropriate strategy that meets all the goals and the objectives of the general plan, and yet still is relatively facile, easy to use, and doesn't cost the development community too much. We don't want it to be counterproductive. So Mr. Dayton had set up a couple of focus groups early on with those that are most involved with the traffic stuff, and we've got that was a very productive set of meetings, and so we're taking that, we're still working that through, and I don't really have anything specific to report on that yet, but you'll be hearing more. But because that's taken a little bit longer than we anticipated, Ms. Weiss came back to the Ordinance Committee yesterday, as a matter of fact, to request an extension of our development plan ordinance, and that seemed to have gone through no problem, and then it'll go to the council next month, I believe, for introduction and adoption. So that'll give us a little bit more breathing room, and so that we can get back to the Planning Commission in early December, and we hope to be to the council with a full package in early 2013. The zoning and LCP map amendments, as you recall, with the update of the general plan, we have a new general plan map, but now we need to make sure that the zoning map is consistent with that, as well as the LCP land use designations. They all need to be consistent by state law, and also just simply because it's much easier to use for our development staff and the community at large that are proposing projects when we have a good updated zoning map and LCP. So we brought this to the Planning Commission for their initial feedback in July, and then held another open house, as we did for the general plan map, in August. And that was a big effort in terms of noticing all the community, all the affected parcel owners. Again, we got a very good turnout at this open house, and we had a lot of calls. Ms. Goulardi must have fielded, I don't know, maybe 100 calls based on the noticing that we sent out on proposed changes. Much of which, I might add, are really come down to lot splits or little slivers, a lot of what we refer to as cleanups, not a lot of significant changes. Although there were some comments that were made, and we have taken those to heart and made adjustments in our recommendations. And so that's where we stand now. We're in the process of actually making those changes to the map and the LCP. And again, you'll hear more about that as we come to the Planning Commission for their council recommendations in the early spring. Highway 101 air quality setback. Most recently was back in February when we brought you the exemption for the pending projects. This is kind of tricky, this one, in terms of what exactly is required by the Air Quality Board, and where does that stand in terms of the general plan, what we're trying to achieve. But the first part was to exempt, those projects that are pending in that swath of land. The next step, which we'll come back to the Ordinance Committee with, is to set up specific criteria for those projects that are within that setback and what they'll need to do to move their projects forward. And we expect that to be to the Ordinance Committee also in the spring of next year. SB 375 / housing element update. This is well underway. And as you'll recall, SB 375, as well as it's related to AB 32 with the air quality portions of it, require that each of the counties and jurisdictions develop a joint regional transportation plan, and with this new element called a sustainable community strategy, and that they both be in sync. So the whole concept here, again, without getting into a lot of details, is really to sync up transportation and land use planning. And so this process is moving right along. The RTP has been, the draft has been, is finished. A lot of the scenarios have been developed. The land use scenarios for the sustainable community strategies were done, as well as the somewhat sophisticated modeling that goes along with that. As the mayor mentioned a few weeks ago, the RENA process was completed, and our allocation was 4,099 units, some 300 units less than we had last time. And we were very pleased that this move forward in a way that is consistent, and the methodology is really sound with what is trying to be achieved with this combining of the land use and transportation planning. The staff of SB CAG are really managing this overall project, and they conducted a series of workshops through September and October to discuss the various scenarios and modeling results that they had come up with. And then the joint technical advisory committee with the transportation engineers and the planners who typically do the housing element work. We've been meeting the last year as a joint group because of this new effort, and voted unanimously to forward a preferred scenario, which is a infill scenario with an enhanced transit component. This is very much consistent with what we're doing here in Santa Barbara, and that was brought to the board last week, I believe, and the board voted unanimously to further that scenario, that preferred scenario.
Enhanced transit. Can you speak a little bit on enhanced transit? And
Yes, I'd be happy to. This was a little bit, again, a little bit tricky here because there was, I believe, 4 or 5 scenarios that met the basic requirements of SB 375. You have to be able to demonstrate that you can reduce the number of trips and meet your air quality standards. And so 4 of these different scenarios met that requirement. One of which was, and let's see if I can recall some of them, one was just improving the jobs housing balance, but not really specifying how that would be done in terms of where the land uses would be located. Another one was the infill scenario, which is very much what it says, focusing growth in urbanized areas along transit corridors. Another one was what I would term more of a greenfield type of development, where development would occur on the outer edges of urbanized development in new, unpreviously developed land. And then the last one that came up was one that was enhanced transit, and it relied on enhanced transit to reduce those numbers of trips. In other words, the vehicle trips. And that's kind of the metric that's being bandied about mostly now is VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, yeah. And interestingly, what the modeling found out, and I hope I'm not getting into too much detail, but this is kind of what I'm into, was that it's really the enhanced transit alone, you didn't get the biggest bang for your buck. And in fact, where you got the biggest bang for your buck in terms of reducing trips was through infill development and bringing jobs closer to housing. So there was some resistance on a part of the other jurisdiction about just going with enhanced transit. And so, and mainly because where's the money going to come from, And people are really concerned about where the funding is going to come for enhanced transit. Everybody thinks it's a great idea, but where's the money? So what was developed was, let's go with alternate 3, which is the infill development, but let's do an add-on where it's not a requirement that we have enhanced transit, but that we'll look at it over the next 20 years and we'll try everything possible to secure as much transit, but we won't be held, our feet won't be held to the fire, through the modeling process. So.
Thank you. Mr. Ledbetter, on this one, can you help me line up some dates here? We have, just kind of, front to back in this paragraph, we have the 2015 4-year effort. Then we have the 2015. Then we have a 2014 deadline by which our housing element needs certification. And, of course, the good news in this piece is that our city portion allocation is 4,099, which is 289 units less than the prior RENA. But I'm wondering, bottom line, by what date do we need to comply with the 4,099 additional units?
That's a good question. misperception that we actually have to build the units. And the fact is, we don't have to build the units. What the requirement is on the RENA allocation is that you can demonstrate that you have the capacity to build the units. And over the last couple of last couple of housing element update cycles, HCD, the State Department of Community Development, has gotten tighter and tighter in terms of making the cities demonstrate, well, okay, how are you going to do that? So which parcels are you going to do it on? Which ones are you going to combine? Is it realistic? In Santa Barbara, for example, we end up doing a lot of smaller parcels, or we do what's called the onesie twosie thing over the years, where we put units behind, existing historic, historic structures. So anyway, the bottom line is that we need to demonstrate that we have the capacity, and we have done that in our general plan update with the land use, that we have clearly sufficient amount of capacity to meet that 4,099. So we're basically done in that regard. Now, when we get to the next phase of it, we don't anticipate that we're going to build something like, we'd have to build close to 3,000 units between now and 2014
Right.
to exceed that.
Right.
And the likelihood of that is close to nil.
So when you say capacity, are we really looking at, sometimes Commissioner Campanella refers to these as opportunities, opportunity sites? And that's really, we're in compliance if we identify that?
Yes, and we have done that.
Yeah.
So we are in compliance.
Yeah.
I've been following along with the SBCAG process as well, occasionally participating, and it's a little hard, the alphabet soup and the different timelines. So I understand that SBCAG will be doing an environmental impact report for the Sustainable Community Strategy and the RTP. Is that environmental impact report going to be of any value to the local jurisdictions when we then need to update our housing element, or will we just be doing the housing element environmental review and process completely separately at each agency? Can you expand on that? And I think that relates to the timing, is that the state has an overall time frame for our COG, our regional government, to have the SCS by 2015, and they are underway with that, but our housing element date is 2014. So if you could just some more on the technical schedule and coordination, that would be helpful.
So as Commissioner Schwartz mentioned, we are required to have finished our next housing element update by December 2014. That will require that we have done the CEQA as well. And what's going to be done through this environmental review will be on this process. It'll be for the RTP, the SCS. It will not drill down and look at each one of the individual housing elements. And again, look at those opportunity sites, look at, if you're consistent with your programs, all that. We'll have to do that on our own. But as far as, the RTP, SCS, and being able to meet it, and one of the key, although our general plan doesn't have to be necessarily consistent with the final preferred scenario that's adopted through the RTP SCS process, nevertheless, we have to be able to accommodate our RENA number that's in that process. So we don't anticipate that that's going to be any problem, but we will have to do our own separate environmental review for our local element.
Sorry about that. In updating the housing element, where does granny units fall into this, and will there be a discussion as part of this stuff prior to December of 2014?
The existing current housing element does call out a discussion, and it is one of the possible implementation measures of the housing element is to look at that issue again. But that's a whole new process, and that would be up to the council to initiate that and say, yes, we would like to open that up and discuss that. Once that button is pushed, then we would go into that mode, if you will. But it will require a lot of just to be frank and honest, a lot of community discussion. The community is somewhat polarized on that issue, and so it would require certainly a public process to go forward with that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a question for Mr. Ledbetter. On the two items, 6 and 7, under 7, the Regional Transportation Plan wants us to focus on infill development with enhanced transit, in other words, locating that development near our transit corridors, and then 6 precludes us from building near our transit, which is the 101 setback. What is the frequency period on California Air Resources Board in terms of updating their monitoring? Because at some point the setback will fall away once the air, has less diesel particulate. So how frequent is that happening on the monitoring now?
I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah.
I have done some additional research in terms of how different communities are responding to the Air Resources Board's recommendations and guidelines. And City of Santa Barbara is pretty unique in terms of the degree to which we responded to those guidelines, creating a 250-foot buffer and really restricting residential development. Most other communities are just looking at it more on a case-by-case basis, and that's one of the issues that we'd like to bring to the Ordinance Committee when we do look at this again. We have spoken with our local air pollution control district, and they don't have the responsibility for monitoring, nor do they have the budget to get involved with that. So they too are looking to the State Air Resources Board. We had put a note in this report again that there could be a small budget item for us to be able to hire an air quality technical specialist sometime in the next year or two to whether or not that means that all the data is available at the state or do some local projections so that we could revise the city's approach to the air quality setback. However, Highway 101, at least fortunately for us, even though we have good transit corridors in other parts of the city, none of the other city streets actually rise to the level of congestion or air quality concern. So when we talk about transit corridors in the city, none of the other major streets such as State Street or Milpas or cross-connecting on Carrillo or Haley and such, we don't have an air quality concern on the local transit corridors. So I don't necessarily see them in direct conflict. There could be individual opportunity sites in close proximity to the freeway that would be affected for some period of time until we update that program.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. On the 4099 allocation, a good part of that would be looking at the ability to provide a broad range of housing product for various income levels. That would be broken down as well. First question is, do you feel that the categories as they're currently broken down is pretty well achievable as well under the RENA?
Yes, Madam Mayor. That was one part of the RENA process that was left untouched. This is the same allocation that's been used for the last 2 cycles, and we think that that's a fair and just way to break that down. And again, this is what Commissioner Campanella is referring to, is that you get your number, your 4,099, but then it's broken down into categories based on average median income. So you have very low, low, moderate, market. And typically what that formula is used to make sure that those that are most deficient or have the greatest need get the greater amount of allocation, so that it's a formula that's divided up between all the jurisdictions, and we feel that's something that not only is fair, but that we can meet that. Okay. I mean, as best we can. We never obviously meet the full RENA number, but in the past we've made strides in all the categories.
Well, and then the goal to get rental housing and employer housing, I guess, would help the state see that we're trying to achieve that, especially for the middle income and lower income levels.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that goes hand in hand with what's under the general plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Chair Lodge. How are we or SBCAG interfacing with Ventura County? Because if we're talking about vehicle trips, we do have a housing jobs relationship with the county to the south.
Madam Mayor, Councilwoman Murillo, SBCAG has had a couple of efforts where they've both worked with San Luis Obispo as well as Ventura and even LA County. You may be aware there was a study done in, it must be 10 years now, that talked, I can't remember, it was something that was what Planning Commissioner John Joseph worked on, and it was, I'm blanking on, regional implementation. And but they did talk about working more closely with our adjacent counties. So there was that distinct effort. Just prior to the kickoff of the SB 375 process, I know that SBCAG was working closely with San Luis Obispo County on a joint effort to look at the jobs housing issue. So they're well aware of it. They've been working with them on that. I also know that there's quite a bit of effort been on the commuter train issue, that we've done a number of mutual aid kind of efforts in that area.
I think more specifically, there's already a contractual arrangement between SBCAG and the Ventura County Transportation Commission on the Vista bus. VCTC is now taking, they're not running the system anymore. It's gone to Gold Coast. There's a new contract arrangement happening. We're having active conversations about what SBCAG's governance role is. In the past, it's been, we've paid through Measure A funds a significant portion of the operating cost for the Vista Bus Express. That's separate from the Coastal Express Limited, which has gone through MTD. So we're looking at that bus transit back and forth, and that's been there's a Coastal Express policy committee that I serve on, along with supervisors Wolf and Carbajal, and then there are 3 members of VCTC on that committee as well. So that's active and happening, in actual transit happening. So that's a big piece of the transit piece. Mm-hmm.
And I believe, Madam Mayor, LOSAN is the name of the group for the...
And LOSAN is the rail JPA, and there was just a bill passed into law a month or so ago that takes the jurisdiction away from the Caltrans Division of Rail to LOSAN itself. And this is looking at the Amtrak service for us in LOSAN North part of it, but this is the rail corridor all the way from San Luis Obispo down to San Diego. And so you have representation of all the regional association of governments in that corridor, plus Metro, and they not just, it's Metrolink, it's Amtrak, it's the Coaster, so looking at all the rail service from San Diego up through San Luis Obispo. This new law now is going to allow this new JPA to have more local control on the details behind the service. And so that's in process happening as well. And then there's ongoing conversations about commuter rail opportunities, working perhaps with Metrolink or something to bring Metrolink up through Goleta. Slow process because Union Pacific owns the rail, and they're very, very reluctant to expand any kind of capacity for passenger service that they believe may take away from capacity for freight, which is their business. So those are ongoing discussions as well.
Okay, so environmental, now that the preferred scenario has been selected by the SBCAG board as of last week, now the SBCAG staff will then go back and begin to draft the actual document, and I believe the environmental review will then, they've already selected the consultant, and that'll kick off, and looking to release the draft of that plan in the spring of next year. The Climate Action Plan, I think as most of you know, was adopted by the Council in September, And our next steps are really the implementation of those actions. As you'll recall, the Climate Action Plan itself was an implementation measure of the general plan, but it has many, many implementation actions. And so the challenge now will be to how we integrate that with what we already do, both in terms of general plan implementation as well as what the city does with their sustainability committee and all of our, the city as an organization through the green team. So a big part of that, we think, will be through the adaptive management program. So you'll hear more of that as things develop. The safety element is underway now. We have a professional services contract with Rodriguez and Associates, and they're helping us to synthesize our existing or more current geologic, seismic, flood, fire hazard data, as well as our policies and the plans like the fire, wildland fire plan and that sort of thing. We've also, I might just remind you that we got over $200,000 in a grant to do this work, and so that we're partnering with the fire department now as well for them to do several studies to look at evacuation both out of the hills and from the coast, as well as what they refer to as operational safety areas, and updating their GIS database for business plans, hazmat stuff, things like that. So that's all underway. We expect to have an administrative draft of that early next year.
Mr. Leber, just quickly, in terms of how you've categorized these activities, for some they've been labeled as completed, but only some phases or aspects of the efforts have been completed, and yet they're still underway. So is there sort of a decoder for me? And like for the Climate Action Plan, it says completed, but clearly that we have by 2013 to truly complete it, and we do have some activities that are in process.
Well, when we refer to completed, we mean adopted. The plan itself is adopted, and a plan is only as good as the implementation, and that's always the next phase. And so typically what I do is report on, okay, well, where do we go from here on it? And it's the implementation. And so if it's underway, that means that it hasn't been adopted yet, but that we're moving towards the adoption, whether we're still in public review or we're drafting elements or drafting new policies. It's depending. There's such a wide variety of different types of projects here. So that's basically underway. Means it hasn't been adopted yet.
Okay, thank you.
The adaptive management program indeed is underway. And here, under direction from the council, we really have broken this up into several phases. And the first phase is looking at programs that we already have. And the one we always like to turn to first, of course, is the water master plan, and what a fantastic job that group does every year in terms of their analysis and reporting out on it. But there's a lot of other programs that we also monitor and report out on, and typically one is the growth management program. Also traffic, the Public Works monitors traffic counts, that sort of thing. So our first initial cut at this is going to be taking those existing programs that we have and pulling them all together into one program with common nomenclature, if you will. And so that's where we're at on that. We'll bring that back to the council. Again, it's council's request. That'll go first to the council so that we can get a little further direction on that, and then back to the PC in early 2013. Emergency shelter zoning. This one is somewhat pending given all the other projects we have on our plate right now, although we are somewhat under a time crunch on this one from HCD the requirement is once you have your housing element completed, you're supposed to be able to identify a specific zone where you can, somebody could establish an emergency shelter without any kind of discretionary review. And typically, you know, right now, our current emergency shelter is under a conditional use permit. That wouldn't really affect our emergency shelter. It would remain in place, but nevertheless, we do need to meet the mandates of this. When we brought this back, brought it to the council, initially, the direction from the council was, well, what is everybody else doing, you know, and what are the actual requirements? And so that's what we're working on now. We're doing the research, finding out what everybody else is doing. We'll work closely with the city attorney's office to find out if any latitude we have in terms of meeting this mandate. So that's kind of where we stand on that.
Mr. Ledbetter, do our winter warming centers help us qualify towards this legal requirement, or not? I mean, is there any way to?
Well, this
to
is
attribute-
separate. This is sort of separate and distinct. It's kind of like the arena number. You know, it's like you don't really have to build a new emergency shelter, but you have to be able to show that there is a place that it could happen without any discretionary approvals. So it's kind of analogous in that way. So it's not like they're out there counting how many beds you have, or even though you know, they certainly do that through the arena process. But for this particular requirement, no.
So I'm wondering, my other question is, do we need to comply by 2013? Is that the fiscal year 2013? Is that a hard deadline for this, for the adoption?
Well, 12 months from when the element was certified, which was May. So May 2013, technically, is when we would need to have that in place.
So do we have a timeline for when we need to start this? Only because, and I understand we have a resource constraint, I'm thinking that there'd be a public process associated with this, given the interest by the public in this topic, and kind of backing into this timeline. Then when do we need to start? And I don't know if they have a comment or not. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I would concur with you that we will need a public process for that. It will need to go to the Planning Commission before it goes to the City Council. And
Council first and then Planning Commission?
yeah, absolutely. But I was thinking in terms of legal requirements and backing that up in terms of how much time we need. So, yeah, we need to put effort into that. So.
At least have a timeline so we know what we're looking at backing into the 2013,
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Would this take the form of an overlay zone?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it could, but as I understand the specifics of it, you just have to identify one specific zone that you can, an emergency shelter can be developed without having to go through a discretionary process like the use permit process.
But I assume that, is it general in the sense like the CM zone or the?
Yes.
Oh, really? So it would be anywhere in the CM zone? Okay, thank you.
Okay. On that? When we were here in February this year, this item was a bit. Just wanted to inform you all, if you didn't already know, that the Eastern Goleta Community Plan is underway, and they are looking at compliance with the housing element state requirement as well, and have identified a new zone category. So they took some land within this unincorporated area and changed the zone and established that one of the permitted uses in that zone is an emergency shelter. And some of those areas with the new emergency shelter allowance as proposed are adjacent to the city along the state Hollister corridor. So I know that the council had a question last time about coordination with other local agencies and whether or not there is opportunity to look at this as a more of a regional issue. And so we do need to do some additional work on that. We're not really prepared to share all the details with you, but there are a number of facets related to that ordinance, yes.
Thank you. I'll continue on here. Building heights over 45 feet. This is underway in sort of a tangential way in that as we've gone to the Planning Commission to discuss the growth management program as well as our average unit density housing incentive programs, there has been a discussion of how the building height over 45 feet would be implemented vis-a-vis these two programs. So we have gotten some good feedback on that in terms of whether it would be going to the staff hearing officer, the Planning Commission, the council, at what point, et cetera, et cetera. And so we are taking that into consideration, and we will be drafting an ordinance amendment, and it'll be included in one of these two programs as it moves forward. Alternative transportation demand analysis. This has been postponed. As you'll recall, the East Side Neighborhood Transportation Plan was initiated by Council last September. Although as different studies need to be initiated, there's nothing to say they can't, whether it's a transportation or a pedestrian master plan update or a bicycle master plan update, that sort of thing. The Arts Master Plan is underway. We've done some initial work with the Arts Commission staff. We haven't done much work with them recently, but we are ready to work with them as they produce documents and give them feedback and take it out for public review. So we're kind of in a holding mode right now with this particular effort. And so that sort of wraps up my summary. If you have any other questions, we certainly can discuss in detail any of these other projects, employer housing, if you're interested in that.
Could you do you have attachment 3 that we have? It has just the list of all 14 projects and the timeline. It might be nice to have that up as we're discussing. No? Okay.
Yeah, I don't.
Well, it's in our staff report. Well, unless it's necessary. If you had it, it would be great. We do have a little public comment. Are there any questions first from council or planning commissioners? Okay, then we'll move to public comment. We have Ginny Brush, and if anyone else would like to speak, that's the only speaker slip I have. Please fill out a slip and come on up to the podium. So, Ms. Brush.
Jenny Brush, and as Executive Director of the Arts Commission, I serve to staff of City Arts Advisory in the Visual Arts and Public Places. I just wanted to give a little bit of an update on the need for the Cultural Arts Master Plan and with the progress that we're making. This is a discussion that we began having when we saw the what we thought was going to be the sunsetting of the redevelopment agency as well as coming to the end of the Regional Arts Master Plan that was established in the late 80s to sort of define Santa Barbara as a cultural arts destination and plans for the cultural arts corridor, and basically the Victoria Street Theater is sort of the last piece of that plan. Going forward, we have a lot of things in the works, and I think it's time to look at a new more definitive plan for art in the city. We have conducted, with support from the number of other not city agencies, but nonprofits, and Santa Barbara Beautiful, we're able to conduct a current inventory of what there is in public art. There's currently a lot of confusion between percent for art county projects, there are private developer projects, there are city redevelopment agency funded public art projects, and so it's important to take that inventory to see exactly what we have. And the public art DVD that we are updating gives us a great opportunity to do that. We have some significant new additions to public art as a result of redevelopment agency, everything from the waterfront improvements to art out at the airport and a number of other areas downtown. All of this is now in place with no definitive plan for maintaining it. I think the chromatic gate is a good example of that, and we want to take an opportunity of this need for the maintenance, and having a arts conservation plan is a big part of what we need in the arts master plan. We have to date, as I said, we've done the inventory. We are now updating, creating a photo archive of all of those various elements in the city to begin to define them. And we want to also take an opportunity of what some of the energy that's going on in the funk zone as a way to consider how art can play a part in the master plan of defining areas of neighborhoods that can serve as cultural hubs. So we're looking at everything to addressing the importance of a need for a community arts workshop space, or to begin to define whether we use transportation corridors or what the vehicle is to begin to use art as a cohesive element for defining public cultural zones or areas, and just have a more cohesive plan that identifies the art in the city and these areas of public benefit, that especially cultural hubs. Nationally, there's been a huge shift in how people experience the arts. You'll see the success of events like First Thursday and so on make us consider that it's time to rethink the use of public paseos and plazas and so on. And I begin to identify those, and to begin identify what areas of communities and neighborhoods might be use public art and cultural events as a way to enhance that. So I just wanted to tell you that we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of a lot of what's going on. The public art DVD will raise attention of these things, and that's in progress. We're working with City TV, and then certainly if any of you had an opportunity to see the charrette show that took place in the funk zone, we see as a great model in terms of seeing how this could be part of the community dialogue. And we thank staff for
Thank you. I think Mr. White has a question for you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes.
If you could stay.
We've seen in the library and in the parks, we have foundations that have been formed to give at least a tax-deductible vehicle for private contributions to essential activities that where we're underfunded as a government. Is there such a facility for the arts? I would think that could be a possible candidate for starting to develop a maintenance fund.
Not sure quite how to answer that. I mean, the county does have a % for art project, and we keep in conjunction with that funding set aside for
I
the
think he's
maintenance.
asking if someone wanted to give a tax-deductible donation for
absolutely,
public art.
yes,
Where do they write the check?
Yes, we can. We don't have one. I mean, we have one that we use in conjunction for receiving things specifically for the county, but we don't specifically have one set up directly beyond that trust fund that we have for the maintenance. And this is something we started about 7 or 8 years ago in terms of recognizing the need for maintenance of the art, and we began to develop that.
Right, but for example,
this-
the chromatic gate, people gave donations. Where did they?
Yes,
How did they
those
write the
went
check to?
To the Arts Commission, dedicated to that trust fund that we have specifically for the maintenance of that. So that's something in place. But what we're addressing here is this is a national issue. There's all of the public art that was addressed and put up in the late 80s, or in the 80s and 90s, and with money set aside for the maintenance, and it's not keeping up with the need for maintenance and conservation. So we're like this is an ongoing national dialogue about public art and the need to conserve and maintain it.
Just another comment there, Madam Mayor, is the Courthouse Legacy Foundation is another aspect of that public-private relationship, which frankly I think it's part of what the future will bring, and that this might be a piece of the conversation going forward for the maintenance of art, and obviously critical, and yet that's a tool that I think if it's more available and more publicized, we might be able to get some revenues out of that. Thank you.
Actually, Ms. Brush, if you could, we just had a presentation from the Americans for the Arts about the economic impact of the cultural arts economy, and if you could highlight some of the numbers just to show the return on that investment, I think is really important.
I can remember them all off the top of my
Yeah.
head. The survey that Santa Barbara was one of 182 communities that took part in this national study, and it was based on figures from 2010, which as far as we can tell is sort of the bottom of where we've been in terms of the economic downturn. And what that study revealed was that Santa Barbara arts and cultural organizations countywide bring in they generate $125 million in economic impact in the county. And a huge part of that, it also employs, I would like to point out, 3,500 plus jobs countywide. And so we're asking people to begin to rethink nonprofits as not just as people that do cultural and have a little bit different business model, but as local employers and small businesses, because most of the money, this was a huge point that was made, most of that money employs people locally. It's not the kind of work that can be shifted offshore or outside the community. So those are very valuable dollars. Those dollars usually generate, I believe it's 77 million. It's about 44 million that the arts themselves generate, but then they also attract audience. The audiences that they bring and the spending that they brings in additional funding. And so really this survey showed that it was just shy of $12 million that the arts and cultural organizations countywide put in both local and state coffers. So thank you for the opportunity to point that out.
Okay. Any other public comment? Krista, you're back there. You're all quiet. No? You're just watching. Okay. All right. Good. All right. I'll close public comment and bring it back to the table here. Unless our ABR or HLC members, you want to have this opportunity to speak? Okay. Nope. Everyone's listening. Okay. Comments and questions from the commission and council? Just go around if you want, or say nothing. Go ahead, Ms. Schwartz.
I was waiting for a council member to make a comment first, but since nobody's jumping at it. You know, what occurred to me from reading this and from our discussion this morning, and actually on the heels of a recent Board of Supervisors hearing on some county park and rec resource constraint issues and whether or not to raise fees in county parks, it underscores for me, I think, the importance of public awareness that we can only constrain or restrict public agency resources, staffing resources to a certain point beyond which we're not going to receive the services that we all want when we want them, as quickly as we want them, and with the high quality that we want them. So I'm hoping as the council gets into next year's budget discussion that there's some public discussion about that, because at some point, if we can't find additional financial resources to add to our staffing, to accelerate or expedite some of these activities, or to satisfy constituents in the community that want things done quicker, we're just going to have to say we're doing the best with the financial resources that we have, and we may not be able to, as community members, receive what we want when we want them. And I think therein lies the rub in terms of making government as lean as it can be, but understanding that as it gets leaner, there are some adverse impacts to what we can get from government in the community. And I just am aware of this from listening to the discussion at the county level, and I think we're going to be facing that again with budget discussions next year. And this brings home for me what we can't accelerate, or we can't expedite because of the resource constraints that we have, and it comes from financial resource constraints. And I think we can only go after so many grants and kind of squeeze out of our fees to the community members just so much before it gets to a point where we can't charge anymore, and we're just going to be as lean as we can, and beyond that, we're just going to have to deliver what we can, and everybody's going to have to say, in these times, we may not be able to get the services as quickly or as robustly and in the way we want them, and sort of kind of ride the rest of the recession out with that acceptance and that understanding. So those are my kind of overall thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. S.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A question perhaps for Mr. Ledbetter. We're talking about the jobs and housing balance and the ratio they're in. And I know that we have a lot of data and we speak a lot about the housing. In terms of identifying workforce concentrations, locations, earning ability, transit to and from the workplace, what kind of efforts are being put regionally and locally in terms of getting that kind of data? Because I would think that would be essential into making that ratio real. And then how does that adjust as the actual job inventory adjusts, or does it? Is it static or is it dynamic?
Madam Mayor, Councilman Rouse, well, you've hit on one of the biggest challenges of that jobs housing balance is really identifying how many jobs there are, exactly what sector. We were just talking about that last week in terms of our staff and how we could try and get those numbers in terms of the adaptive management program to understand, how effective are we being in terms of bettering our jobs housing balance. Typically, those numbers are, we derive those on a regional level, and they're it's a reductionist thing. We do know who the biggest employers are. We certainly know how many people they employ, but there's a lot of mom and pops out there that we don't know exactly what the number is, and it's one of the hardest ones to track. So we generally rely more on the regional efforts, what the university, through the economic forecast, the numbers they come up with. We have in the past, I think about 6 years ago, as part of the Plan Santa Barbara process, we had an economist come in and do some estimates as well, and they relied a lot on some of these local studies that have been done, and also took some of the national data and reduced it down. But it's not an exact science, and it's something that we're constantly looking at and trying to figure out ways that we can get that information in a more accurate form. So unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for you on that one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. John, the Workforce Investment Board did a conference back, I think it was April or May of last year, where they had a consultant actually look at industry clusters and job clusters around the county. And they were able to break it down by job type and also different quartiles of pay, whether it was low, medium, or high, and sort of match it around the county. Coastal Housing Coalition has spoken to them, Ray McDonald, where perhaps this early spring they're going to combine those results with the Mark Sneap report that was done on housing and the conference. And I don't know where they are on formulation, but the idea is try to put both of those aspects together on one joint conference that would show where the jobs are and also where the housing needs are. That's sort of the idea. So you might talk to Ray to see, to get the base information that's already available. It might be helpful to look at and see, maybe you can give them some input on what you would like to know when they do the next conference to provide you with information on that. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I want to say, just in general, it's a huge amount of work before the planning department. And given the constrained resources, it seems you're doing very well, and thank you for the efforts that have been made. I don't see how it seems as if you're moving forward on everything except the alternative transportation demand analysis. And personally, if you're looking to see whether any of us want to change the priority ranking, I would like to see the Arts Master Plan higher up, but I also understand that the other things do seem to they take priority at this point. So thank you for your efforts.
Ms. Murillo and then Mr. White.
Thank you.
Mayor Schneider, thank you. Chair Lodge. So my question is along the lines of Chair Lodge. So is there sort of a competition, or are the resources competing to ranking number 2 and number 3, the historic resources element and the average unit size density program? I would really like to see staff working on the average unit size density program. Is there tension there, trying to get one of those two, working on those two items?
In response to the, Councilmember Maria's question. Sorry, thank you, John. There are different staff groups presently assigned to the historic preservation work efforts and this set of housing policy. That doesn't mean that we couldn't shuffle additional resources in to any of these projects and make a change. But the staff we have working on the average unit density program, namely with the leads being Irma Unsueta and John Ledbetter, Irma is also tracking, looking ahead to this next update of the housing element, as well as the emergency shelter program. So her most current project is the average unit density. Quickly on the horizon is the emergency shelter, and then towards the housing element update. And as a project manager in the realm of housing, it makes a lot of sense for her to continue to be the lead. She's the most knowledgeable on that, and all these projects overlap. Pulling in additional staff resources from the division to help on that would take away from something else. Whether or not I would see it as a direct effect on the Historic Resources Program, perhaps could shift resources such as, I'm just talking about people to help you understand, like Heather Baker, for example. She could perhaps be additional resources in this area if I were to pull her out of some of the other program in terms of historic resources. Oh, yes, I'm reminded that an important city resource on all these projects is the city attorney's office. And I think we did talk a little bit about that last time as well. Both Mr. Wiley and Mr. Vinson are in the audience, and we have their involvement throughout the process, and we try to manage our demands on them a bit. I have 5 or 6 different staff working on all these programs, and there's Mr. Vincent. And so, that is a consideration that we kind of work. Planning staff works on a lot of different things, and then we work through the city attorney's office a little bit more, one at a time. And our top priority right now is the growth management ordinance.
Okay.
And then second in line is the average unit density.
Okay.
And a companion to either one of those will be the building height. So shortly, those 3 are at the top of the list. So I don't know. I probably gave you more information than you needed, but yes, I could look to say taking Heather Baker out of the realm of historic resource and support in special studies there, and maybe make a little more progress on some of these.
Okay.
But I wasn't planning on doing that.
Thank you. So I have 2 other items. One of them I think is part of the agenda, and one of them is would be like new business or something. But tell me, I guess I'm nervous about mentioning something that's not really on.
It's related to council planning issues, I think, and time and workload and asking a question. I don't see that as a problem. So it's a new issue, but how does that incorporate with everything else? I think that's a legitimate question.
Okay. Well, somewhere in here was referenced citywide architectural guidelines. And so 901 Olive Street came up, and I'm looking at you, Councilmember White, because you said you prefer Spanish Mediterranean architecture, which that project was not. And then I thought to myself, well, if that really is a community priority, then why don't we talk about letting all the project applicants know that that's the style that we prefer, if we do. And Councilmember Francisco made a good point that eventually all buildings fall down. So if we start, or get rebuilt, so if we start designing everything in Mediterranean, eventually everything will be Mediterranean. I don't know, way looking into the future. So I'm just bringing that up because 901 Olive Street sort of gave me a headache. And I think it challenged us about really, do we embrace mid-century modern architecture? Anyway, so that was one thing. And then the other thing I'll mention is 2 people have approached me, one from the ABR and another from the Single Family Design Review Board, that they want their $50 stipend to start again. So I see Mr. Zink out there and Mr. Suding. So I'm just throwing that out there that, and I think the Planning Commission, right? They got a stipend of some kind at one point. Oh, you're getting yours. Okay. Okay. So I'm.
Per meeting, not per hour. Let's put that out there, yeah.
Of course, you guys have so many meetings. Anyway, I'm just throwing those two items out there since we're all together. And I'm sorry, one last thing. The ZIR situation, it causes pain to the real estate industry. So I'm really hoping that we can, it seems like a big problem and a big challenge to sort of make everybody happy. But I hope we do find a way to make everyone happy on ZIRs.
It's Mr. White and then Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, just to extemporaneously respond to Ms. Murillo's comment, I think it's certainly a valid point to bring up that where do we want to have the stucco and tile vernacular focused, and where is it? Where are we backing off on that? Is definitely part of the discussion that's going to be helpful going forward to a developer. You do not want to have this confusion of here's the line, but it's not really the line for is it a district or is it a district that emphasizes that or not? And that was the confusion that we ended up with on that project. And as I said in a hearing shortly after. A few days later, I said, where I felt I missed the ball was in scale on that project. If we'd done planned Santa Barbara scale on that project, I think we would have seen it become more compatible from my perspective, at least for that neighborhood. So that was just that issue. The things that I want to talk about today are kind of annoyances for, I'm sure, everybody at the table. Number one, and it's only adding to staff workload, but I'll back up and say, first of all, I appreciate month in, month out, year in, year out, that we have been working together on these things. I get to sit in the chair, and then you guys get to go back and spend long hours working on these things, and I just truly appreciate the many years of your work, your personal work, and the team's work on these efforts. But I don't want us to forget about a couple of things. One is the hedge ordinance. We've kind of put it away, and I think that this is one of the areas where I hear from folks, citizens out there, that this is it's a problem. And we now have hedges that are growing up into people's views, and there's nothing to be done about it. That's, if I'm correct, I mean, staff isn't enforcing that. We just basically called a timeout. My take is that if we were to reinstate side and rear hedge heights, that would solve many of our problems. So I want that. I would appreciate having that discussion sometime along the way. We've got it in place. It's just it's a kind of a wink and a nod, and I think we ought to at least revisit it and either get rid of it altogether if that's where the votes are, or at least clarify that more. Another irritant, which is really which so many people confront, is our zoning ordinance. And it's an elephant in the room. It's a mess. We're talking about wonderful new zoning and LCP Map Amendments. The maps will be lovely. And then when you go back into the spaghetti factory that is our zoning ordinance, there's about 6 people out there that really understand this thing. And sometime along the way, we're going to need to step up and invest in a rational zoning ordinance. We're talking about this in the darkest of hours. We've been all these years of underfunding. Someday, we hope things will get straightened out a little more. But that's just one that I think is, I just don't want it to drop off and away so that people are not mindful of it. Another area which I expect we'll get back into in the budgeting cycle is cost recovery. I know that the policy over the years has been one of bumping up incrementally the percent of recovery that fees cover. I was asking a question earliest on about I heard there's a slowdown a little bit in the public works component. There really is a cycle of where the development community is willing to pay if they can get the service, particularly if they can get relatively faster service. Time is money in that arena. We're seeing ministerial work. What I'm hearing is more ministerial work coming in. And I want to make sure that we're tuned in well with being responsive. And I expect that's going to be pretty common as we hopefully recover more. That's going to be the ministerial work that's going to be rising. And we want to be responsive to that. We want to be able to turn those projects around in a timely way. And so that cost recovery, even though it's painful to pay a bigger fee, what I think we see, we have right around us in this region other jurisdictions, Goleta and the Santa Barbara County, both of whom have a much stronger policy of cost recovery. And I'm not suggesting we go all the way there, but if we can make our timing faster on processing those projects, I think we'll have an ability to charge a little more. So as we get into the budgeting arena, I'll be asking about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just to touch on the stipend, that covers my gas, my paper, and my toner, because I go to a lot of meetings other than Planning Commission. So that stipend's very well used. It's not a per hour it doesn't go into any frivolous fund at my house, in my office. It really helps. As the city goes paperless, I have to print more. So the end user is hitting that print button pretty often. So anyway, that money's budgeted in my household. Something I don't want to have pass away in the public works is the underground utilities programming. My husband and I trained for the community emergency response team, and we took an advanced training in electrical emergency. Anytime a power line is down, you have to set up a 30-foot perimeter, and even if there's a vehicle in there with somebody bleeding out, you cannot cross over that perimeter around that power line. So I look at it more as a matter of public safety. I also look at it in the 101 corridor as projects go forward as something Caltrans can do to mitigate what I consider to be the increased concretization and standardization that's occurring to us. So we should be asking on projects to do that underground due diligence. And that's one of the things that I think Planning Commission is missing. When Mr. White left, I've tried to sort of captain along, and so that will have to pass to someone else. But that awareness and importance for public safety, I think, is extremely, extremely important. And Commissioner White's comment also on the hedge ordinance, I call it the privatization of public views, where we want people to walk, where you can look at the mountains when you're walking and do all this healthy stuff, and all of a sudden you're looking at people's really homely front fences and overgrown hedges. Makes for not a pleasant walk. So I do a lot of walking these days, so I'm one of those people who goes along going, curse you. Oh, that's nice. You get real picky about your route. So anyway, the other is on the emergency shelters. Shortly before, I couldn't attend the Casa Esperanza hearing, I'm sorry, because I had a surgery, but I did attend before that the Board of Supervisors meeting, and during that meeting, in the initial part where they talk about the budget and stuff and the money they're laying out, they gave several $100,000 to Casa Esperanza. So I'm wondering if we are considered tacitly the regional solution for shelter. So I think that we need to follow money trails to see if that is actually occurring, because if it is, we are expected to fulfill something that perhaps we're not prepared to do. So I just want to bring that up as a point as we're looking at our CM zones. Where is the money coming from? And where else could it go in terms of fairness? So if we are expected to be the regional solution, they better just come out and say it, because then we need to do more than just this sort of beat around the bush planning. We need to be able to do what we need to do. And those are my comments. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess mine are both irritants, too, so I'll just follow on Bendy. But one of mine was to totally agree with him on the common complaint that's heard on the process of project processing, and that I agree with him. It's what I hear back is it's typically not a dollar concern, but more a time and process concern. That the dollars might be there if only you weren't almost paying for the option to be held hostage to a process and a long, timely thing. And I think the challenge is there with the doom and gloom of lessened resources in out years is to recognize that the way to effectively start to climb out of that is to encourage economic development that still meets our standards. And you have to do that in a manner that opens the door to those opportunities without having them feel like they're not being engaged in an effective process that they can still go through and bear the time and the expense. I don't know what that looks like on nuts and bolts, but I just know that's anecdotally what I hear. I don't know if we're doing any focus group type of work on a recurring basis to get more than anecdotal stories, so we could have specific situations that somebody can specifically talk about a process and what they had to go through, and staff can respond and say, well, here's how you had to go through it, or why you had to go through it, and then together they can come up with a better way to go through it the next time. The other point I had too was also on the first slide, the zoning and enforcement, and I think this is the third year I've had the same reflection on that, and I continue to be frustrated with the lack of enforcement support. It seems like again from a development process, we front load everything with standards and compliance, and then on the back end we don't really have an enforcement process out there anymore that follows up, whether it's signs or parking or whatever it may be. I've personally noted banners that have been hung up downtown, your typical happy hour, free beer, 3-foot by 40-foot banner on a new restaurant, and 2 months later that banner has still been up after I've brought it to the attention of the city, and it's just because of lack of resources. And I know those things multiply exponentially given, especially in the downtown core area, given the intense competition economically, and then the sight lines, they kind of multiply like bugs. When one goes up, you see a couple more go up, then you see a couple more go up. And it seems to me that the tier system that was mentioned on priorities, I think should really also reflect downtown core area, maybe Upper State Street and the waterfront, and those get really responded to rather than say the Mesa. They're so much more key to keeping what the image is of Santa Barbara and the attraction of why people come here, that I think those are crucial to have some type of response that elevates and keeps those standards in place. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
To follow up on Commissioner Jordan's issue about zoning enforcement, do you ever see that we'll get in a position to be proactive on zoning enforcement, or are we always going to be in a reactive mode?
Predominantly, our enforcement program has been proactive, but there are, reactive response to complaint. But there are a few elements of the city's enforcement program that are proactive, so I'll touch on those. One has been prohibited signs In the right-of-way, the sandwich board signs, there have been what we call sign sweeps where we've gone through on that, and then certain prohibited sign types where we've done some proactive efforts. Another is through the Neighborhood Improvement Task Force, which is a multi-departmental coordinated enforcement program where problems in terms of trash, unsafe building conditions, zoning, fire concerns, where the city has worked together and had some proactive enforcement. But otherwise, we are in zoning predominantly a response to complaint, and that is something that, to some degree, if we were to make a shift in that, we would want to work with the city attorney's office. Our system is definitely set up to be response to complaints. However, I think the concern raised by Commissioner Jordan in terms of condition compliance, that's another form of enforcement that we hear certainly from board and commissioners. We have much fewer complaints or inquiries from board and commissioners, I think, because we don't really have a system of monitoring and going back and looking at projects very regularly, whereas we do receive a lot of complaints from residents in the community and other businesses. That's how that whole ball of wax we try to divide into priorities and get to. And for the last year, almost to 2 years, we've had very little enforcement activity, whereas about 3 years ago, we were at a peak period where we had 2 full-time enforcement officers plus an hourly, and we were really, really on top of it at that time. So I think to be effective, my experience is at that level is where we've been most effective. And we've fallen off from that quite a bit.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I think on the good news front, there's a real economic revival, especially in the housing sector, and I've been pleased to witness, especially in the rental housing lately. And I'm concerned that by kind of dragging out or not being able to get to a conclusion on the implementation phase of all the planning that we put so much effort to over the years, that we're actually slipping behind other communities, especially those to the south. I mean, they've adopted all new ordinances, some form-based. They have more rental housing going than we could even handle with our 8-year experiment that we've allowed here. So I think we're hampering our own ability to solve our jobs housing imbalance by not finishing up the implementation. So I think our focus really needs to be on getting the incentives on board so that developers are not waiting in the wings. That's why Planning Commission has had no projects for the last year and a half. We don't have anything to review. We're missing out, I think, on a real economic opportunity that is there, and the few developers that do venture forth under the old rules get chastised for following the old rules. Well, it's hard to have it both ways. So I think we're in our own way. We should prioritize our efforts into the things that are the incentives to get things moving, and then follow up with adding more regulation. More regulation isn't going to incentivize anything, and I'm glad to say that this isn't typical what we're experiencing here, but I think we have the solution in our hands if we prioritize our efforts, and that's the good news. It's not somebody else hampering our efforts. I think we just need to be organized and really prioritize what it is we truly want. So, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Back to enforcement, and this triggered Member White's comments triggered my memory of about 5 years ago, before I was appointed to the commission. I had some communications regarding enforcement with, I think it was then Mayor Marty Bloom, Council Members Doss Williams, E.F. Falcone, and Mr. Wiley, because we have some significant ongoing offenders, enforcement offenders in the city of Santa Barbara. Some of you know who they are, without mentioning them by name. And I had learned that in Ventura County, they have an ordinance, or maybe it's just a law on the books that allows them to charge under a certain structure the ongoing high level or high volume offenders, so that that municipality can recoup some of its funds used disproportionately in going after these greater volume offenders. And I don't think that we followed through on that. I think Mr. Vincent's still here. I'm not sure if he's willing to take this up with Mr. Wiley. But I suggest that we talk to some other municipalities about how they're recouping their scarce financial resources where there are disproportionate offenders who know, just to some comments made today here, that we are in a reactive mode. So that will mean that there'll have to be a complaint lodged. And then when our resources can get around to following up on the complaint, so by that time there are even more offenses taking place. There are more violations occurring. And so I think that we're being exploited in the city of Santa Barbara, quite frankly, by these greatest offenders who understand our constraints and our process and the loopholes. And I think there are creative ways to get around it by talking to other municipalities who have found a way to crack down on and recoup their money spent disproportionately in these types of enforcement issues. So here it is 5 years later. I'm coming back around to this topic and asking, if we can have some city attorney resources spent in some quick research on this to find out what best practices are being done in some other municipalities who have some of the same issues, could even be by the same offenders, that we help ourselves. Because I think, to come up with more enforcement resources on our own, it's sort of, the dwindling resource we're going to keep kind of cutting away at or chipping away at the resources we have, and I don't think that's the smart way to address what's eating away at some of our enforcement resources disproportionately. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of notes as well. First off, I do want to commend the staff on this long list and thank the Planning Commission ahead of time for some very detailed work you're about to undertake, and especially in terms of the average unit size density and the zoning and LCP map. I mean, those are going to be some real minutia type of work that's so important. So when it comes to us, we can just say thank you very much and pass it. That's our goal, right? That's how it's supposed to work. I think it's our job, though, on council to hear the workload concerns and think about the budget for next year. Scott, please take your vitamin C, and stay well. But, if so, for both this department and the city attorney's department, and really look at the budget to see if we have the capability of adding to it. I don't know the answer to that. There's going to be a lot of things. We're at that point where we're maintaining and we want to bring things back, but do we have the funding to do it? And we don't want to accelerate that too fast because still the economy is a little tenuous. It's looking better than it has been, but it's still a question mark. So that's a budget question, I think, for us that can only help. And I think Mr. Bartlett brought up a good point of what can we do policy-wise that helps the economic development, so that can then help us, create the funds to provide the services and not have the backlog of the planning and permitting process. The Arts Master Plan, I also want to bring up, the Historic Resources Element process, where this amazing wealth of expertise and community volunteerism coming together, working with staff, obviously, a lot of staff work, but that extra human resources was spectacular. And I know the local arts community is just chomping at the bit to create something. So I don't know if there's some way to get them started that can at least help them do some research or something that might not take as much staff time from the beginning, but some way to try to work something out so we can at least get things motivated. Because again, I think that's another economic development component too, and that can help us in the long run. I want to bring up the ZIRs a bit and a policy issue as you move forward. One of the issues that's come to my attention that's a policy issue is whether it's due to we have better information now or more detailed when a property is changing ownership and there is a new ZIR report, is we're finding sometimes mistakes from the last time staff went out to monitor, and so there are things in the new ZIR that was not put in the one when they bought the property, and now they're selling the property, and now they're on the hook for something that really the previous owner should have been on the hook before. And it's the way the staff are in a bind because they have to follow the code, and once they know about, so for example, an as-built project that the previous owner put in but wasn't fixed because the ZIR didn't catch it, and now they want to sell the property. It's now noticed, and it has to go through a modification, or it has to go through, and then talk about timing, and then they're trying to put it on the market, and this housing market, it gets difficult. To me, there's a difference between an as-built thing that we missed before versus something that a current owner did when they shouldn't have, maybe without permits. And that's opening up. I think the hedge ordinance is going to be tough. I think this is going to be tough too. But I think in terms of what I'd like to try to avoid is the city being the impediment towards the move towards people allowing to buy and sell homes and moving the housing market forward. So I don't know how we can do that, but that is something that's come to my attention recently. And then finally, in the post-redevelopment agency world, maybe there's a discussion, maybe in another joint meeting, of brainstorming a little more about what can a city do to help economic development without an RDA. Whether that means in terms of planning and processes or incentives for new economic growth, or what do we do about affordable housing without the funding? What does that mean for not only new projects but rehab of older older units? I think we need to have that conversation at some point, and what can we do to be a little more proactive? And I'm not quite sure where that fits in. And I know that's adding a lot to this, but the more I think we can do to help revive action, that can then bring up funding that can then help us in the long run. So, and then one last thing, just as a request to the Planning Commission. I know you've been involved with the 101 HOV project. You had a hearing from Caltrans and SBCAG, and I know you made recommendations to one of the alternatives. The EIR process is still happening at the Caltrans level. There is an issue with the Cabrillo Railroad Bridge that is not part of the EIR project that I know we don't want to repeat what happened when the 101 improvements happened 10 years ago, where something was put in as a condition of approval that really could not have been addressed because it required UP to say yes, and they had total veto power, and they said no. And this has to do with the pedestrian underpass at the railroad bridge. So right now, there's nothing in the 101 HOV project that even addresses the traffic impacts of that bridge, and that bridge does need either replacing or something. And I've been talking with SBCAG and Caltrans quite a bit about this, and the answer has been, well, let's get through the EIR process for the 101 improvements, and then we can look at this as a separate project. Well, the rub for them is it has to come to you, Planning Commission, for the coastal development permit to things to move forward. And so that's a big hurdle for them. And I think as much as we can try to define in much more detail and certainty about how we're going to address that, I think is important for our interest, not only for the city, but also just looking at the pinch point of congestion, not just for pedestrians and bikes at that point, but for the cars. It's going to be a pinch point at that part in that Cabrillo Hot Springs underpass, in that interchange. So just to put out there, those conversations are continuing to occur. It may surface or not surface here and there, but I know that you're a key part of moving that forward, especially when it gets to the permitting phase. So keep that in mind. And I think those were all my notes. And thank you again for all your work. Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In response to your comments about the problems at the railroad bridge near the Cabrillo Hot Springs 101 intersection, that did not go unnoticed by the Planning Commission, and we asked, but just as we are advisory to the City Council, it was simply a request on our part. But it seemed perfectly clear that that had to be rebuilt, and so that there can be, for one thing, a right turn lane from Cabrillo onto the freeway on-ramp. And we did ask.
I know you did, so. But like I said, the permitting process, that's going to be a big piece. Yes, Mr. Campanella.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Not having gone through the ordinance process for a general plan, for my information and public information, as the ordinances come through the ordinance committee and then goes to city council, is there time, these are public hearings and time for public comment, because I think what's beneficial in looking at some of the ordinances that have come through is that there are references to why it's being done, where it's coming from. It's very well spelt out of what's being done, as opposed to, let's say, either planning commission or city council meetings that may be looking at staff reports and getting in where people really can't pay attention, I don't think, or don't have the attention to that. So I'm presuming that that will be well disclosed, because a number of the items that we're working on for implementation really affect property owners and property rights. And I don't think at this point people have been paying attention, perhaps, or aware of what may be occurring. And it's not only the property owner, it's the realtors. Is there proper disclosure being made relative to transfer of property, not just for development, but it just may be changing hands. So I'm hopeful that both the content of the ordinances as well would be clear and specific on what we're trying to implement, continuing that, and then also more public awareness that they should come out because it might be affecting them.
Yeah, I'd like to address that. The state planning law and the city process that goes along with it actually encourages participation at all points, but with a focus on the Planning Commission. And the hearings coming up with the Planning Commission for both the growth management ordinance and the average unit density size, that's where we do the display ads. That's where the council, again, as the mayor has stated, what's coming before us is expected at the Planning Commission to go into a little more detail, consider a range of input that's offered from the community. That's not to say that when it goes to Ordinance Committee or City Council that there isn't also public dialogue, but the emphasis is at the earlier stage at the Planning Commission as you're developing your recommendations to City Council. The Ordinance Committee stop is a little more of a, it's a city procedural measure that the City Council has appointed an ordinance committee to, again, look at more detail to make sure, working with the city attorney's office, that the ordinance is in place as to fit into the city's overall municipal code. And it's an opportunity for at least the three on the ordinance committee to get involved a little more in depth on some issues. And then there's the hearing at the council, which is extremely important in terms of the introduction and then the subsequent adoption. But in response to your comment about general public awareness and considering the input, the process works well when that is definitely happening at the Planning Commission. And we have been out in the community talking with a number of interested stakeholders, along with the Community Housing Coalition in terms of the conference that was held there, our discussion on the workforce housing, stakeholder groups in terms of the traffic yesterday at the AIA. And so, of course, this is also following on a 5 to 7 year process where we've engaged the public to set the policy direction. As Commissioner Bartlett said, this is the immediate next step that, again, public continuation of public interest, infusion of new or additional questions is certainly open, but it's not as if these implementation steps are, okay, a whole new major public outreach effort. At least that's what our work program envisions, is that this work has been occurring at the Planning Commission as we have gone to you in the preliminary workshops we've done. And now we're headed to actual hearings for recommendation. So the last 6 months has been the general development of the programs, and now we're going to the hearing portion. So I don't know if that's different than what you're suggesting, Mr. Campanella.
I think the point would be, I think when it gets to an ordinance, it's it's laid out as these are what the rules are going to be, rather than discussion. So I think it might be, clearer to the public that this is what's going to be enacted and how does this affect you and do you want to comment on it. We've had, a number of meetings of Planning Commission, of course, in their discussion and advisory, but the final decision has been made by City Council when they adopt. Now, when it comes back again as an ordinance, I'm just asking whether that's a time to let people know exactly what rules they're going to have to comply with before the ordinance is signed.
Mayor Schneider, I'll clarify. The City Planning Commission will be presented with the actual ordinance as well. So your point in that there's been policy discussion, general guideline direction, yes, it is important that at the Planning Commission hearing you are reviewing the actual zoning ordinance, yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and we're adjourn the meeting.